meals together over the years, and I'm grateful for that. And he always has something powerful to say, and I'm excited to hear what God's doing in Rochester and what God's doing through you as well, brother.
What time should we end?
I say about 8:15. That will give us a chance to maybe do some Q&A if we have as well.
Nice. Okay. Perfect.
Yep.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that really great introduction. Like Pastor said, Andrew and I have been married for 28 years, and First Bible's been kind of a base for us since she was, I think, in the nursery for her, but for us throughout our marriage, this church has played a really important part in our lives, and so it's always great to be here, and I love opening the Word with people who know God's Word very well, because got a few things we want to talk about tonight. When I was 23 years old, like Pastor said, I'm the director of a new ministry here in Rochester. It's been in existence for coming up on 2 years, called Refuge Rochester, and we are helping churches and individuals, Christians, embrace and welcome refugees and immigrants here to our city. And the path that God started me on with this, basically, it kind of started when I was 23 years old. When I was 23 years old, I lived in Germany. I was a youth pastor on a U.S. Army base, and went away on a junior high retreat. And while we were on this retreat, the Berlin Wall fell. And we came back, and the world was different right in the course of a very, very short time. And I remember there was a time when we looked at the Berlin Wall as something that was political, something that the world stage had changed, that there was a communist government, and communism was basically crumbling all across Central Europe. But I remember praying and just saying, God, I hope that God, I ask that you would prepare the church for this here, that you'd be moving people in your kingdom to respond to what's happening globally. And I sensed the Holy Spirit say, well, you live right here, it's right over, it's just a couple hours drive. Why don't you start responding? So a group of us started responding. A few years later, soon after that, Andrea and I got married, and we moved into the Czech Republic. And basically, I spent the next 20 years of my life responding to the fall of communism in Europe, which changed the world for all of us. Anybody who's alive at that time, we remember that time. But one of the things that we learned during that time was that the changes that happen like that are not political. They are not things that happen naturally. That the more that we looked around, we walked around, and the more we learned, we realized that really this was a work of God. That when people looked closer at what was happening in Hungary and Romania as dictators were being pushed out, really what was happening is the church was becoming such that the governments could no longer really contain it. And as much as the fall of communism was a political event, it was really something to do with the work of God and the gospel. And that lesson has really kind of stuck with me. 10 years ago, Andrea and I came back here to Rochester to help our kids get out of our house and be by grandparents and just kind of go through this season. And during that time, I began to meet refugees, and I began to hear about, I remember I was reading about that there were 800 or a great number of Bhutanese refugees that were resettled in Rochester, and I was like, well, I'd love to meet some of these people. I worked at a medical company at that time, and I entered an elevator at a nursing home, and the elevator filled up with people that were all brown-skinned and about this tall, and spoke some language I couldn't understand, and I thought, I think I just ran into the Bhutanese, and they were. I've since come to know that. And I began to just see all around me that there were different refugees and different people that God was bringing here to our city. And I began to sense God saying, it's time for you to make a different change. It's time for you to maybe step into something. There's something that's happening globally that I'm a part of, and I have something I want you to do in part of that. There was a time that I so I began to walk around Rochester, and I began to really realize that there's a lot of different agencies, a lot of different people working with refugees. But at first, I wasn't running into a lot of Christians. I was at an agency that's on Dewey Avenue one night just to see they had a tutoring program for people who wanted to get their GED. And I went there just to observe it and meet the folks that were running it. And all of the volunteers that were running it were Mormon missionaries. And I left there kind of going, I just sat in my car and I just prayed and I said, God, I know that there's different churches not far from here. There's people that I know that know you that are right here. I just ask you to do something that someday we'll see that there's actually somebody who knows Jesus sitting there. Whether they can actually even talk to these people, I just would love to see the church step in to this part of our community. So God began to keep moving and leading, and then we started Refuge Rochester. So I want to just, but tonight I want to just start talking about what is a Christian response to immigration and refugees. This right now is, if you are an American, you have a view of immigration and refugees because this is one of the most divisive issues in our country right now today. Whether you are looking in, whether you're studying it, whether you're kind of looking to see what should I believe about this, your view is being shaped by the media and by just the news we watch, by what's happening around us, and we all are having our views shaped on this issue. It is one of the most, as I've taken a few years to kind of learn it, it's one of the most complicated issues I feel that's part of our world today. And I feel that God is a part of it. That just like when nothing changes without God being a part of it. And as people around the world are being displaced, He is the one that I want us to see. How can we see this whole issue through God's eyes, through the Scriptures and through His character? So we're going to go forward a little bit. I want to give you a few. Let's go to the next slide. I want to give you a couple definitions, okay? The first definition I want to give you is actually what is a refugee. I realize now this is kind of small, but a refugee is a person who has fled the country they're in because of persecution, okay? Sometimes because of wars or natural disasters, but the UN has a definition that if somebody flees their country and is displaced because of a fear of persecution that is caused by their religious affiliation, their social group, their political affiliation, or their ethnic affiliation. So all around the world, there are people who are fleeing their country because maybe their ethnic group. Like if you look at the country of Myanmar, Burma, that there are, in the last few years, over 1 million Rohingya Muslims have fled that country and are now living in Bangladesh. Waiting to see where can we go from here. Can we go back? It's still very unsafe. And that was an ethnic group and a religious group. If you look at the country of Syria, it's been all over the news. Around 6 million Syrians have been displaced. About 3 million of them live in Turkey. About 1 million of them live in the country of Jordan, Lebanon. Some have come here, but they fled their country because of it was a political war. And probably some ethnic issues in there. So a refugee is somebody who's fled their country because of a fear of persecution. And they apply to the UN to see, can we either be resettled into this country right here where we're at, or if we can't go back or stay here, is there another place that we can be resettled to? The second definition I want to give you is the definition of asylum seeker. Okay, if you follow the news, if you see what's happening on the U.S.-Mexico border, there are people coming to our border and asking for asylum. And one of the things, basically the definition of a person who's asking for asylum is somebody who's basically a refugee. They fled their country for some kind of reason, and they've come to another country and said, can we find safety in your country? The major difference between a refugee that we have coming into our city, an asylum seeker, is where they ask for protection. Refugees ask in another country. Asylum seekers can legally come to a port of entry like San Diego or New York City or Miami, where there's an official entry into the country. They can come and ask for asylum, okay? Third definition, as we talk tonight, is immigrant. Is somebody who comes and lives on a more permanent basis. They come for either work or to reunite with family. One of the largest groups, one of the largest sources of immigrants into the United States right now is India, China, these Southeast Asian countries. We often think of Mexico, but the largest group of immigrants that are currently on an immigration status here in the U.S. are from India and China. If you've ever had a medical procedure done by somebody either born in Egypt or Saudi Arabia or India or China, which I think I have had some medical procedures done from people born in India, they were here on an immigrant visa, and they are immigrants here to our country. Last definition. This is an important one here right now today. Undocumented immigrants. This is also something that's really in the news, that people who sometimes they're referred to as illegal immigrants or illegal aliens. Well, I would like to suggest that we as Christians use the word undocumented immigrants. We are all here pro-life people, right? We believe that God is God of life. If you and I were to hear somebody refer to a baby in a womb as a fetus, we would have a pretty strong response to that. Am I right? We would say, hold on. It's not a fetus. It's a baby, right? Because we don't want to use the word fetus for a baby, because when we use a word, it affects how we view that person. And we say, well, hold on. If you call this a fetus, that means you're feeling probably fine about, get rid of a fetus is fine. Get rid of a baby has a different emotional response. Do you understand what I'm saying? We all feel that way as pro-life people. And if we want to see people the way God views them, we have to be careful about the language we use. When we call somebody an illegal alien, they become something other in our minds. But very often, most people who are undocumented, they actually enter the country under a legal visa, usually student visas or tourist visas, and those visas run out. I was involved with a young man who was a student here from Ghana, and he was here on a student visa, which is a very easy way to come, and he flunked out of school. And unfortunately, took a bus from where he was to visit a friend here in Rochester, and he was picked up by the ICE at the bus station in Rochester, and he was put in the detention facility in Batavia for about a year, simply because he flunked out of school and his visa ran out. So he was an undocumented immigrant. And one of the things that we say is that immigrants and refugees are not problems to solve, but they are people to love. Whether whatever their status is, whether they're a refugee or an asylum seeker or an immigrant or undocumented, we are commanded to love. Whatever's happening legally, they are people for us to love. I've become friends with a gentleman who's actually currently in the detention facility in Batavia. He was born in Iran. He fled Iran in the 1990s and applied for refugee status when he was in Germany. After 2 years, his paperwork was approved, and he was resettled in Buffalo. But about a year ago, he has to go regularly as a permanent resident. He had to go regularly to the CBP office in Buffalo, which is the Customs and Border Patrol. And they had been looking at his paperwork back in 2000, and they discovered that there were some discrepancies in his paperwork. So his paperwork was marked as fraudulent, and he has been in the Batavia Detention Center for the last year. Unfortunately, there's a good chance he may be deported back to Iran. But fortunately and unfortunately for him, he became a Christian when he lived in Germany, which is how somebody connected him with me. And if he's returned to Iran, it may not go well for him because he's had some stuff on his social media, had pictures of his baptism on social media. There's a real fear for him that he may not be treated very well when he goes back. But the reason why he is undocumented is his documentation initial about 18 years ago wasn't done correctly. So we need to be careful. I want to just first of all say, if we're going to see people the way God sees them, we need to be careful with the words we use. We don't talk about a fetus, we talk about a baby. We don't talk about illegal alien, we talk about an undocumented person. And there's multiple reasons why someone becomes undocumented. Let's look at the next slide. I want to give you a couple of pictures of the global crisis here. Let's look at the first one. Currently, it's estimated there are about 68.5 million, 65 million people who have been displaced either through wars like in Yemen or those folks that are fleeing Central American countries, or like I said, people that fled Myanmar because of there's a huge group of people. There's a new group of people fleeing from a country called the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's been a war that's been happening there for a while. And there's the fighting in the last 6 months has really ticked up, and there's been a large new wave of refugees, people fleeing some areas of Congo. It's affected a lot of people that live here in Rochester. About 25 million of those are classified officially by the UN as refugees. Like I said, when somebody flees our country, they'll go and present themselves at a UN spot, and the UN will do some interviews. They'll check out and they'll see, is this person legit? Do they have any kind of identification? And they will look and see. And then about roughly 25 million of those people have been classified today as refugees. They're in places like Uganda, Kenya. Some of the largest places in the world where there are refugees is, like I said, Turkey, Bangladesh. There are millions of refugees in those countries. Roughly half of those people are under the age of 18, and half of those people come from 3 countries: Syria, Afghanistan, and Sudan. Places that if you follow the news, you know there's some pretty rough things happening there. There's about 44,000 people a day that flee their country, flee where they're at. Sometimes they end up staying within their own country. Sometimes they go back. Some of those people, like people that would be considered people who flee their home, would be when there's flooding in, say, Louisiana because of a hurricane, and people, they leave there and they become displaced people. Okay, so roughly there's estimates about 44,000 people a day flee their country, and they're considered refugees or people have fled. Only about 1% of all refugees are resettled annually. So that 25 million, often people, when they become officially a refugee, the process that it takes, if you start the process before you get into the United States, it's at least a 2-year process. Let's look at the next one. The average refugee will remain in a refugee camp for roughly 17 years, okay? There's a huge population of people from Nepal. I got a photo of them back in my, these Bhutanese refugees that fled into the country of Nepal. There's about 5,000 of those folks that live here in Rochester. When I talk with them, I say, how long, they were all in their refugee camp in Nepal for about 18 to 20 years. It's just everybody you talk to has been that way. So a lot of the people, if they're under a certain age, you just know they were born in that refugee camp. So let's look at the last one here. I think there's one more. Yeah, let me show you this here. This is a dear sister. Some of you know that I was in Nepal. I went to be a part of a church that was opening up. I was asked to go there by some of these. There's about 5 Nepali churches here. So they've used this building here a few times in the sports park. So I went and visited the refugee camp in Nepal. This is the gentleman on the left is a pastor named Bim Duba. He is a pastor in Nepal that I spent a week with. He's a pastor of a couple different churches, and one of the churches is a church on the refugee camp. The woman on his right has lived in the Beldangi refugee camp in Nepal for 27 years. She fled, her and her family fled when she was a teenager. I would say I had the privilege of having dinner with her and another family in this little hut with a UN plastic roof on it, and I would say she's joyful. She loves Jesus. She was part of a worship team in the church. She deeply knew the Bible, and I felt privileged to meet her. But she has lived in between for 27 years. There's about 7,000 Bhutanese Nepalese who fled Bhutan. They're stayed in Nepal, and it's really uncertain as to where they'll end up. It was one of the largest refugee populations for a while, and they've been resettled all over the Western world. So let's go on one more. I want to talk about how this global crisis is felt locally, okay? In the last 20 years or so, there's been about roughly 15,000 refugees that have been resettled in Rochester. The first arrivals came back in the 1980s. You remember, I'm sure, that there was these initial refugees that were arrived here all over the country from Vietnam. Over 1 million Vietnamese after the Vietnam War were settled. Then when there were wars in places like Bosnia, Sudan, and Ukraine, you began to see refugees come here. There's a large Bosnian population, and if you don't know any Ukrainians, just probably look around the building here. You'll probably see some. Recently, the recent arrivals that come right now are from places like Bhutan and Nepal, like I just mentioned. Cuba, there's a growing Cuban population here in Rochester. There's an Iraqi population. Somalia. There's probably like 3,000 people here in Rochester from Burma. A couple of good churches there. There's a small group of people from Syria. Like I said, the Congo. There's a large number of people from the Congo here in Rochester. Afghanistan and Ukraine. Recently, actually, I think tomorrow there's a family of 5 that's arriving from Afghanistan that's being resettled. Anybody who comes from Afghanistan or Iraq, the reason they're coming here, I mentioned this last time I was here, is that they're being evacuated by the U.S. government because they supported the U.S. military during the war in Afghanistan, and their lives are in danger. I had coffee with basically a decorated veteran of the U.S. military. He was Iraqi. He had spent some time in a coma. He showed me his medals, his medals that he's received from the U.S. military. He was a translator and a kind of liaison for some special forces groups in Afghanistan. And he and his family were evacuated as the war kind of slowed down here. This is a scene from Syria that, like we said, refugees are people who are forced to leave their country. If you've seen any images of Syria, it's one of the bigger refugee crises that are happening, and we even read about in the news here today. Like I said, about 6 million people fled their homes, and basically the country is being kind of destroyed. The infrastructure is just being kind of destroyed. Let's look at one, go to the next slide here. These are people who are stuck in between. The woman on the right here, I want to show you these, there's 2 slides here, we can look at both of them. We just sent 3 women from our team of Refuge Rochester to Lebanon to observe the Syrian refugee crisis. They went with a team of refugee workers from Chicago. And one of the things they said, like I said, for every 4 people that live in the country of Lebanon, there's a refugee. It's one of the most saturated countries with refugees, and they come from Iraq, Syria, and Palestine. There's some Palestinian refugees in Lebanon that have been there for years, 30 years. One of the things they said, there were 3 things that I wish I could have one of these guys here to talk to you, but they saw the church. Lebanese Christians are ministering to Syrian Muslims, and the pastors there kind of go, we couldn't have asked for this. There's no way we could have planned this. And Muslims in Lebanon are coming to know Jesus through Syrians. And one of the issues that's really come up is that I think in the 1990s, there was actually a war between Syria and Lebanon. And some Lebanese, they hate Syrians because their family members were imprisoned and tortured by Syrians. And some of the Christians that our teammates met, they hated Syrians. But one of the things that the churches are saying now is that every act of kindness is an act of forgiveness for what happened in the past. So God is doing great things in the country of Lebanon with the thousands of Syrians that are there. The other thing they said is that they heard from almost everybody is that we want to go back to Syria. Like, there wasn't anybody that came to and said, hey, we'd love to go live in America. If a refugee is resettled in a place like Rochester, it's not an easy thing to go through. It's very cold. I mean, just think if you lived in a country like the Congo. But they eventually, I have some friends that are actually Syrian, and I was just at their home the other day because they're Kurdish, and I wanted to just go have dinner with them because of all the things that are happening to Kurds right now. And one of the things they said to me, I was just shocked that they said, we love America. There's just great laws here. Like, it's a country of law and order. which, like, they're learning how to drive. They're like, there's driving laws. Like, people drive and they just stay in one lane, you know. So they just go, it's great here, but it's been extremely difficult. The husband, I would just say, he's been depressed since he got here. Like, he misses all his friends, and it's nothing like where he lived. The third thing that they always heard from people was, don't forget us. Make sure you tell our stories, you know. They were in different homes, people having tea, very hospitable people. When I was telling somebody here, I cannot go to my Syrian friends' homes without eating. I say, can I just have a cup of tea? And no, like, I have a whole meal, you know. Extremely hospitable, and that's what they encountered when they were in Lebanon. And we just see that these are not problems to be solved, it's people to be loved. And they're people who are made in the image of God. So let's go a little bit farther here. Let's keep going. So how should we respond as Christians? I want to tell us a few things we have to remember, okay? First thing we got to remember is that these people are created in the image of God. Moses said in Genesis, for in the image of God made he man. Let's look at the next. I got another little verse on there too. And as much as you've done, this is what Jesus said, and as much as you've done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. Okay, he looks, Jesus, if we want to see the refugee crisis and the immigration crises that are happening, if we can go to some political views, we can look at the different polarized views of it, but we can also say all of these people are made in the image of God. You know, I had the privilege of spending a week at a shelter in Arizona for people that were being released from ICE that had crossed the border and sought asylum. And I was spending the night at this facility one night just to be kind of the person overseeing it. And a prayer meeting was happening with this group of people from Honduras. And they were people who were in the image of God, and they knew God. So if we want to see these people who God has displaced, we got to remember they're made in the image of God. Let's go to the next one. We have to remember that the stranger and the foreigner has always been close to God's heart. I want to read a verse from Deuteronomy. This is Moses talking about God. He doth execute the judgment of the fatherless and the widow, and loveth the stranger, in giving him food and raiment. Love ye therefore the stranger, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. This phrase, you were strangers in the land of Egypt, God says this through prophets and through his leaders often in the Old Testament. I just read something recently, and I know I haven't had a chance to really study this, but you can take a look at it. I heard somebody say recently in the Old Testament, there is never a command to love your parents, your husband, your wife, or your children. Never a command in the Old Testament, okay? There are 3 commands that have to do with love in the Old Testament. Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor, and love the stranger. Those are the only 3 commands in the Old Testament. Lisa, I just read that recently. You can check it out. You can go home, look around in the Old Testament. There's only 3 commands to love people. One of them is the stranger. Because God views, he is, if we read the scriptures and we look for how God talks about the stranger, people that are not from here, his heart is always with them. Here he says, this isn't a stranger that's from their country. He says, you were in Egypt, you were in another country, and you were viewed as strange. You want to have some strange people? Go meet somebody from Afghanistan. Okay, they got some strange cultures. They're beautiful, but they're strangers to us. And God, his heart has always been a heart of the stranger. Is there anything else there? Oh, yeah, the book of Ruth. If you look at the book of Ruth, okay, here, Mara, what was her name before she went? She came back and said her name was Mara, the why? Huh? Naomi, yes, Naomi. So Naomi goes to another country. Her husband and her 2 sons die, and she comes back with only one of her daughter-in-laws, and she says, my name is bitter, Mara, you know. But if you look at the book of Ruth, the country of Israel had whole laws about how you should treat people who are foreigners. Do you remember what one of those were? Don't harvest everything around the edges. Remember that? And Ruth went, and what was that for? It was for widows, orphans, and foreigners. They actually had laws to say, and actually that type of work actually was the work that they themselves did. It wasn't like we're going to leave the work like cleaning the hotels for all the foreigners. We're actually going to leave space for what we're doing. We harvest barley, we harvest wheat, but we're going to leave some for the people on the margins. And God's heart has always been there with people who are on the margins. Let's go to there's also that famous verse I talked about last time I was here that Jesus said, I was a stranger and you took me in. I was a prisoner and you visited me. I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. He always hides himself among people on the fringes. Remember that God is sovereign and therefore in control of the global crisis of displaced people. Well, let's look at this next verse here. This is from the book of Acts. This is Paul talking, and he says, and God hath made one of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, where they will live. He determines that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. Like Kevin said, God is bringing people here from all over the world that we would have an extremely difficult time bringing the gospel to people who live in Syria. I mean, our lives would be in danger. But now they live in Greece. You know, we would have a very difficult time going to Afghanistan. And there's an apartment complex over in Brighton where there's like 30 Afghani families that live on one street. You should go there sometime. I can help you with that. Here's a little quote. Among people of non-Christian religious traditions in North America, most of them refugees or other immigrants, 60% say that they do not personally know a Christian. Okay, so and this is just natural. If you were to meet a doctor from India, probably spends a lot of their time with people from India. You know, the Afghani people, they spend time with people from Afghanistan. They want to get together and speak their language, and they want to be, just like we tend to be with people who we know. But this is something that it's real. I read a story about a woman who came from Pakistan, I believe, to the United States with her parents. They were in the medical profession. She came from a Muslim family. And after she lived here for 25 years, and then she met a guy that she kind of started fall in love with, and he shared the gospel with her, and they got married. But she lived for 25 years before she really heard the gospel clearly. And it's just the way it happens. There's not any judgment on anybody for that, but just 35% of white evangelical Christians in the U.S. say they personally know a Muslim, and even fewer know a Hindu or a Buddhist. Right here in Rochester, there's a very developed Muslim community. There's several different mosques. There's an Islamic center on, I believe it's on Westfall Road, that there's about 2,000 people that attend that center every Friday for prayers. There's a developed Hindu community here in Rochester of people from India, Nepal, and few of us know those people. I wanted to show you a photo here. It may be tough to see this, but do you recognize anybody in this photo right here? Look at the woman right in the middle. That's Nancy Curran. It's kind of hard to see. It's kind of far away. But this is Nancy. Nancy called me one day, and she said, she sent me a message. She said, how can I meet some of these people you're talking about? And I just met this beautiful family from Afghanistan. It's tough to see, but the mom is there to the right, standing right next to Nancy. And I took this family to get some clothes at a clothing closet. And when I drove them home, I realized that the mom really could speak English, but with her kids and husband around, she just let them talk all the time. So she said, I asked her, like, would you want somebody to come over and just like speak English with you so you can keep practicing? And about 2 days later, I heard from Nancy. So I said, hey, we can go meet somebody right now. So her and I went. We had tea with this family. And if you and I were to walk into this home, we would get very warmly greeted. You know, like they would probably put their hands, like kind of nod their head. The women don't shake hands with men. But if Nancy Curran goes there, she gets the 3-kiss treatment, like the welcome. One kiss on this cheek, the other cheek, and then back to the initial one. Like they just love Nancy Curran. This is 2 of her granddaughters there. They came out there was a day off school here, and the kids went and they learned how to, they did the henna thing on their hands and learned some Afghani stories and had some Afghani food. this is somebody now. This is a Christian here who now knows a Muslim, and she's loved by those Muslims. And Nancy's had some good conversations with them. You should ask her about it. Let's go to the next one. How should we respond as Christians? Let's go. As Christians, we have an opportunity. This is one of the things that Kevin talked about. And a responsibility to extend compassion to brothers and sisters in Christ, and therefore to Christ himself. God is bringing a lot of Christians to the United States right now. If you go down in the city, there's several churches that are made up entirely of people from the Congo. Their worship is pretty lively. But they love Jesus. And there's people, there's like I said, there's a number of churches made up entirely of people from Nepal, and there's several Burmese churches. And if, like I said, when I was at the border, I saw that God's bringing people across into our country that actually know him. And I wonder what he has for us in that. What is it that he wants to teach us through bringing people who, even though they love Jesus and they followed him, really bad things happened to them? What could we learn from them? So we have to, one of our responses, we have to realize and remember that we now have an opportunity to welcome and love people that are brothers and sisters of ours. We also have an opportunity to give an answer to every man that asketh about the hope that is within us and to teach all nations. God's bringing nations here. I want to show you one other photo here. I don't know if you can see this guy on the right here. This is a real hero of mine, Ron Bourne. That's him on the right. There's a large deaf refugee population here in Rochester, and Ron is a part of the leadership of an organization called the Rochester Deaf Refugee Advocacy Group. They just had an international conference at RIT, I believe it was in June of this year, and there were hundreds of people who work with refugees that are deaf around the world that came together, and Ron's a part of this organization. And I would assume that these are all Nepalese people in that photo. I'm sorry, I got a bad photo of them. I'm assuming they're Hindu or Buddhist. And here's Ron driving them to some doctor's appointment or something, okay? So the church in Rochester is on the move. Uh-huh.
From their homes to a classroom.
Okay, so take them to a classroom, okay? Ron's a big part of this. If you want to learn more about this, this is a work that First Bible you would be proud of it. I went to a breakfast one time that Ron was a part of, and I met a family from Syria. The dad was deaf, and they had no sign language before they came here. They just had a little way that they as a family talked to their dad, and then the kids would do all the translating. But Ron's organization is teaching him how to talk so that he can be out in the open on his own with refugees. Just a phenomenal work, and Ron's a big part of that. He was there, tapped me on the back, and here I am with the brother in Christ sitting across from a family from Syria. Let me tell you some steps we can take here. One of the things I always talk about is that we use the analogy of jumping in a pool. It's better if you kind of dip your foot in the pool a little bit. If you sense that God could maybe have you do something among these people that God is bringing to us, here's some ways you can kind of dip your foot in the pool. The first one is you can talk with Ron or talk with me about there's different agencies that we work with. There's always looking for somebody who would drive and say, hey, I could drive this one day of the week. If you need somebody driven from their home to a doctor's appointment or a class, let me know. There's people who are preparing for their citizenship test. They like somebody just to go through the questions. There's people who are, there's some places that we've even helped people just kind of adopt a family and just kind of come alongside a family. And like I was just telling someone beforehand, one of my Syrian friends, she's a woman, never had an opportunity to drive in her country, but she has a permit, and she was saying, it has to be a woman. Is there a woman that could teach me how to drive? And so there's different ways. If you would like to find out about something, you can let me know. There's a school down in the city that I always talk about. It's a school. It's part of Rochester City School. It's only refugee kids that go there for 2 years, and every year they do a big Thanksgiving meal. If you'd like to go and hand turkey out to refugee families, I think last year they had 700 people come through on a Saturday and experience a turkey dinner. Second thing is, you can take the 40 Days of Scripture challenge I have out there. Out at my table, I got this is a little bookmark. You can just read a different scripture for 40 days, and it gives you a little biblical overview of this whole topic of the stranger and how God relates with them throughout the scriptures. The third thing is you can connect with us at Refuge Rochester. I got information out at the table with our Facebook page, our website, and an email address. If you would like to even just get some more information, you want to hear maybe some things you can read, you can connect with us. And we are going to have a conference on January 18th of this coming year in 2020. We're going to do it at Northridge this year. Last year, we did it at a Free Methodist Church. The year before, we did it at Grace Road Church down in the city. But we're going to have a one-day conference. If you get on our Facebook page or our website, you'll get more information about that, and we'll follow it up for you. If I could do one thing before I go, I know it's time for me to go, but I want to read a psalm to you, okay, as we close. I'm going to read Psalm 146. Praise you, the Lord. Praise the Lord, O my soul. While I live, I will praise the Lord. I will sing praises unto my God while I have my any being. Put not your trust in princes, nor in the Son of Man, in whom there is no help. When he talks about princes, he's talking about a government official. Don't put your trust in princes. His breath goeth forth, he returneth to the earth, and that very day his thoughts perish. Happy is he that hath the God of Jacob for his help, whose hope is in the Lord his God. And these are things that God has done, that God does, which made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that therein is, which keepeth truth forever, which executeth judgment for the oppressed, which giveth food to the hungry. The Lord looseth the prisoners. The Lord openeth the eyes of the blind. The Lord raiseth them that are bowed down. The Lord loveth the righteous. The Lord preserveth the strangers. He preserves them, upholds them. He relieveth the fatherless and the widow, but the way of the wicked he will turn upside down. The Lord shall reign forever, even thy